and welcome to the presentation entitled People Are Like Museums, Ask Before You Touch. This presentation is going to focus on sexual violence and how sexual violence is defined at Bow Valley College. One of the reasons, or the reason that we feel this is an important presentation to present at new student orientation is that sexual violence is a quite prevalent topic that we're having in society right now. And as you enter into post-secondary school or higher education learning, it's a good opportunity to learn more about what topics are being discussed in our society as well, and how these things might be experienced by individuals who are also attending Bow Valley College. So our three objectives today are to define sexual violence. So we're going to define that broadly in society and also define it more specifically at Bow Valley College. The second thing that we're going to do is we're going to learn how to recognize sexual violence. So that might be recognizing sexual violence experiences for ourselves, recognizing sexual violence experiences of others, or perhaps even recognizing some of our own behaviors that may be unwelcome to others. Another piece that I want to touch on as we're talking about recognizing sexual violence is that I want to recognize some people watching this video may have their own experiences of sexual violence already, and I want to note that the information in this presentation is not exhaustive of everyone's experiences of sexual violence. And so if there's information in here that impacts you, I encourage you to reach out to somebody who you feel safe talking to, or even at the end of this presentation, as you see, our last objective is to identify some resources. So if you see a resource that you feel safe reaching out to, I invite you to do that as well. So one of the first things that I often get asked in relation to sexual violence is, what is it? And you may have heard the idea that it's about power and control. But then the follow-up question to that is usually, what does that really mean? So we're going to talk about that. So power and control is the use of somebody's status or position to influence someone else's behavior. The use of a status or position. So as an example, what sex do we typically in our society associate with having more power? Would you think that a man or a woman would be perceived to have more power? So typically in society, people would answer that a man has more power in society. Another example would be when you think about somebody who's sober or somebody who's intoxicated, whether that means intoxicated by drugs or alcohol or other means, who we typically perceive in society as having more power would typically be the person who is sober and not intoxicated. So those would be positions that somebody would use to gain power over somebody else in a sexual space would be considered sexual violence. So people often explain that they felt uncomfortable in this situation or that it was impossible for them to say no, even though they're unable to explain what specifically was done that made them feel that way. Those are often the feelings associated with it. They may also say things like they felt out of control in that moment. Another piece about power and control is that or sexual violence and power and control, is that it's self-serving. So it's about the individual who's engaging in that behavior, and it's dismissive of the other person's wants, and typically doesn't have any concern about what harm may be caused to somebody else. Okay. So with that in mind, what is sexual violence? And here we're going to talk about what and how Bow Valley College defines it. So within our policy that we have, it's a sexual violence policy. Sexual violence is defined as an act carried out physically or psychologically without consent through a sexual means or by targeting sexuality. And I know that might seem, a bit vague, but as we go through, hopefully we'll be able to add some clarity to that. What we mean when we say through a sexual means is any sort of act or behavior that is considered to be sexual. Sometimes I suggest replacing the word sexual with intimate. So if there's an act or behavior that feels intimate, that may also be considered sexual violence as well. So oftentimes those words are interchangeable. The second piece to that is by targeting sexuality. So what that means would be if an act was either taken or specifically not taken because of how somebody is perceived to identify. So if something was done or not done because a person was male or female very specifically or identifies otherwise, then that would also fall under sexual violence as a target to somebody's sexuality. Hopefully that makes sense. So some examples within our policy of sexual violence are sexual assault, sexual harassment, stalking, indecent exposure, voyeurism, degrading sexual imagery, and distribution of sexual images. Now again, this is not exhaustive of all the types of sexual violence, but these ones are specifically laid out in our policy that you can take a look at. I want to note sexual harassment. Oftentimes people think that it's referring to behavior that happens multiple times. Sexual harassment is a one-time experience or multiple experiences of sexual violence, of sexual behavior that's unwelcome or unwanted. In reference to stalking, that can be in person, but it can also be through text message, social media, or other technology means as well. So oftentimes people think that it's just in person, but it also refers to any sort of continuing to pursue contact through any means. So our policy also defines consent, considering that's a big part of sexual violence. So these are the things that our policy defines must be present in order for consent to exist. And all of these things need to be present. The first thing is that it's voluntary, which means that there's no force, and we'll define force in just a second here. The second thing is that it's active. So that's in reference to an active versus passive consent, and I'll give you an example of what that means. So an example of passive consent would be if you attend school in Canada, in our elementary first grades elementary system, typically one of the programs that are offered is around sexual education. And so a letter would go home to your parents and it would say, we are going to teach your child about sexual education. If you don't want them to participate, please let us know. So in that scenario, consent exists to participate in that education unless it's revoked or taken away. That's considered passive consent. Active consent, on the other hand, is when it doesn't exist and has to be specifically given. So an example of that, I'm going to go back to school again, is let's say, for example, you were going on a field trip to the science center. In this scenario, a letter would go home to your parents and say, we're going to the science center. If you want your child to participate, please let us know. If your parents did not sign the letter and send it back, you would not be able to go to the science center. However, if they did say you could go, then you could. So that's an example of active consent. Consent does not exist unless it's specifically given. And that's what has to be present in order for consent in a sexual space to be given. So consent also has to be direct, unimpaired, conscious, and agreement. So agreement means equal power. So we talked about that power and control piece in there. So if there's a scenario where there's not equal power, it doesn't automatically mean that consent is not given, but oftentimes when there's unequal power in relationships, that can lead to sexual violence. So when you're agreeing to a sexual experience, in that moment, there has to be equal power. So we're going to define force because we talked about that consent has to be voluntary. So it could be physical force, so physically restraining or holding someone to engage in a certain activity or preventing them from leaving. Coercion is unreasonable and persistent pressure. So this is, if you've ever heard the idea of the broken down no. So somebody asks another person to do something repeatedly over and over again, providing different reasons as to why they should do that thing. and eventually the other person gives in and says, fine, let's just do it. That's not a true yes, and consent does not exist in that scenario. Then we talk about intimidation. So intimidation is something that's called an implicit threat. So it's vague, and it might be an example of, if you don't do this, you're going to pay for it. So it's not specific as to what might happen, but the other person often feels as if something bad is going to happen. Then on the other side, we have explicit threats. And explicit threats would be, if you don't do this, then I'm going to harm you in this very specific way. And so that one provides more specific reason to fear, and then is a form of force, and would, if any of these pieces of force exist, then consent doesn't also exist. So I'm not going to read through each one of these, but we're kind of getting to the end of the presentation here. What does sexual violence actually look like? We talked about the different types of sexual violence that may exist, but these are some more specific acts that happen or could happen that would be considered sexual violence. So I would encourage you to take a read through this, and if you have any questions, when we get to the contact section at the end, feel free to reach out and ask if you want to know more about any of it. On the left side, you'll see there's some images there. So I want to point out again, we talked about the idea that stalking can happen in multiple spaces. Sexual violence in general can happen in multiple spaces. So it could happen on social media, it could happen in person, through text message, it could happen in classrooms, groups of people, gatherings, it can happen through email. It doesn't have to be something that just happens in person, so I want to make note of that here. Okay, and finally, like I said, we would talk about some of the resources on campus. So within our Learner Success Services, we have the option to speak with a counselor. So if you have experienced sexual violence, or know somebody who has experienced sexual violence, or maybe you're wondering if some of your behaviors are unwelcome in a space that may be considered sexual violence, and you want to talk about that, you can speak with a counselor confidentially here. You can also make a disclosure to anybody within the college community and let them know that you've experienced, or you know somebody who's experienced sexual violence. And what that will do is they'll be able to support you in receiving some other referral resources, as well as support your learning if you're able to identify some specific supports that might be able to help you. And you can talk to them about that too, as far as helping you identify what those things might be. And the third thing you can do is make a report. So you can make a report to the Sexual Violence Response Liaison and ask the college to formally investigate the scenario. So if something has happened either on campus or related to campus activity, the college can investigate and try to determine what's more likely to have occurred and support you in that way. The other thing I have noted on this slide is the idea that we also offer workshops. So we offer a couple of workshops each semester, and one of them is our bystander intervention workshop. So if you're curious to learn more, we will be offering those. Keep your eye out in the student e-news, and you can take a look for when those are offered and sign up to learn more. So that's the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and here is the contact information for the sexual violence response. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Thanks.